November 20th, 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The pencil trembled in Unteroffizier Werner Krebs' frost-numbed fingers as he stared at the metal tray before him, unable to process what his eyes reported. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, cranberry sauce the color of arterial blood, green beans, white bread, apple pie. This was either elaborate mockery or proof that Nazi propaganda had been catastrophically wrong about America. Krebs had been captured 3 months earlier in Tunisia, where his company had subsisted on hardtack and horsemeat when they were lucky. The journey across the Atlantic on a converted Liberty ship had prepared him for execution, labor camps, or starvation rations. Instead, he sat in a mess hall warmer than his family's apartment in Hamburg, surrounded by 300 fellow prisoners, all staring in silence at Thanksgiving dinner. The psychological demolition of Nazi ideology would not begin with re-education lectures or propaganda films. It would begin with this: a carved bird on every table, served to enemies behind barbed wire. Before we continue, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your location right now. And if you're finding this story as unbelievable as those German soldiers did, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to this story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II. The arrival at American camps between 1942 and 1945 represented a systematic shock to German expectations. Roughly 372,000 German prisoners of war would pass through American custody during the conflict, housed in approximately 500 to 700 installations scattered across 45 states. These were not the concentration camps they had helped build in occupied Europe, nor the prisoner compounds they had seen on the Eastern Front, where Soviet captives died by the thousands. These were wooden barracks with coal stoves, electric lights, and mess halls that served portions exceeding what most German civilians had eaten since 1939. The mathematics defied comprehension. American quartermaster logistics could ship concentrated Thanksgiving foodstuffs, turkeys, apples, oranges, eggs, across the Atlantic in November 1944, so American troops in Europe could celebrate the holiday. That same supply chain fed enemy prisoners on American soil with a caloric abundance that contradicted every assumption about warfare and national resources. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, recorded his first impression in a letter that passed camp censors 3 months after his arrival. The mess hall smelled of things I had forgotten existed: hot grease, fresh bread, the citrus tang of oranges. I thought perhaps they were fattening us for some purpose, that this abundance was temporary. Then I learned this was standard. This was simply how Americans ate even in wartime, even when feeding enemies. The sensory assault began the moment prisoners stepped off transport trains at camp gates. Camp Concordia in Kansas, sprawled across fields that had been farmland 6 months earlier, now transformed into 300 wooden buildings arranged in precise military grids. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter every 100 yards. Barbed wire glinted in the November sun. But inside that wire, warmth, electric lights, the unmistakable aroma of roasting meat drifting from kitchen buildings. The architecture itself communicated messages the prisoners struggled to decode. Wooden frame barracks with Celotex insulation and asphalt roll roofing, crude by American standards, but palatial compared to the muddy trenches and dugouts most had inhabited in Tunisia or Italy. Double-tier wooden bunks with thin mattresses and army-issue blankets. A single coal stove in each barracks that actually received fuel. Communal latrines with running water and periodic delousing stations that prevented the typhus epidemics common in European camps. This was survival infrastructure built for enemies. Feldwebel Otto Schultz, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who had endured 8 months of desert warfare, wrote in his diary, "I expected brutality. I expected revenge. American soldiers had every reason to hate us. Instead, we received medical examinations, vaccinations, clean clothing. They explained Geneva Convention rights in fluent German through officers specifically trained for prisoner processing. They treated captured soldiers with more dignity than our own officers had shown us in the final months in Africa." The first meal service became a moment of collective cognitive dissonance. Prisoners lined up with metal trays, not wooden bowls, not tin cups, but American military mess kits, and watched as servers ladled portions that kept coming. Canned meat, vegetables, bread without sawdust. Red Cross food parcels supplemented camp rations with canned Spam, corned beef, powdered milk, sugar, coffee, dried fruit, and chocolate. Items that had disappeared from German stores in 1941 now appeared daily in American prison camps. But Thanksgiving represented something beyond mere sustenance. November 25, 1943. Across dozens of camps in Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and the Great Plains, German prisoners experienced their first American holiday. Kitchen crews had worked since dawn preparing birds that weighed more than the weekly meat ration for an entire German platoon. The Army had allocated resources for this: turkey, giblet gravy, cranberry jelly, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pumpkin pie. Menus that mirrored what American service members ate in field hospitals across Europe, now replicated for enemies on home soil. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, captured the moment in his hidden diary. The mess hall doors opened at noon. We filed in expecting normal rations. Instead, we saw tables laid with something impossible: a feast. Whole turkeys on central platters, steam rising from gravy boats, the clatter of metal cutlery on trays, the murmur of 300 men falling silent at once, unable to process the contradiction between our status as prisoners and the abundance before us. The sound of that silence. Why would a nation at war, fighting on 2 fronts, spending billions on bombs and bullets, allocate resources to feed enemies this way? The question gnawed at prisoners who had been taught that America was weak, decadent, collapsing under the weight of its diversity and democratic chaos. If this was collapse, what did strength look like? Some refused to eat, suspecting poison or psychological manipulation. Others wept. A few became physically ill from consuming rich food after months of field rations. But most simply ate in stunned bewilderment, each bite demolishing another pillar of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness and moral degeneracy. Camp commanders understood the psychological impact, even if prisoners did not. Feeding enemies well accomplished multiple objectives: compliance with Geneva Convention requirements, yes, but also something more subtle. Every full meal, every electric light, every flush toilet became evidence of American capacity. This was psychological warfare through prosperity, more effective than any leaflet or radio broadcast. The human cost of that prosperity appeared in letters prisoners wrote home. Letters that German censors would later use to understand how completely American abundance had shattered Wehrmacht morale. Dawn at Camp Concordia, December 3, 1943. The metallic clang of reveille echoed across frozen barracks as Gefreiter Paul Fischer buttoned a donated American overcoat against the Kansas wind, preparing for his first work detail on an American farm. cold breath condensed in the pre-dawn darkness. Guard boots crunched through frost. The scrape of truck engines warming in the motor pool signaled another day that would dismantle everything he thought he knew about his enemies. The labor program that sent German prisoners into American fields would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any battle. By late 1943, acute labor shortages threatened American agricultural output. Young men had shipped overseas, leaving crops unharvested and processing plants understaffed. The solution arrived in guarded trucks, tens of thousands of German prisoners assigned to harvest sugar beets, detassel corn, hoe cotton, and top beets across the Midwest and Great Plains. Geneva Convention rules permitted non-military labor, and American farmers paid the government roughly 80 cents per day per prisoner. Wages held in camp accounts as scrip that could buy tobacco, candy, and small luxuries from camp canteens. The work itself was backbreaking. 8-hour shifts under prairie sun or winter wind, wielding hoes and knives in fields that stretched to horizons prisoners had never imagined possible. But the real shock came from what they witnessed beyond the labor. American abundance made visible through casual, everyday prosperity. Obergefreiter Hans Becker, assigned to a sugar beet farm outside Scottsbluff, Nebraska, recorded his first day in a letter that reached his family 9 months later. "We rode in a covered truck for 30 miles, no blindfolds, no restrictions on what we could see. The guard, a farmer's son from Iowa, shared his cigarettes and spoke broken German. He pointed out his family's farm as we passed. 300 acres, he said casually, as if this was nothing special. In Germany, such holdings would make a man nobility. The farms themselves contradicted every assumption about agricultural production. Single tractors, John Deere machines worth more than everything Fisher's father had earned in a lifetime, could do the work of 100 men. Combines moved across wheat fields like ships across oceans of grain, harvesting 100 acres daily. Mechanical corn pickers, automated irrigation systems, electric grain elevators processing tonnage that would have required weeks of manual labor in Germany. This was mechanized farming on an industrial scale. But the most profound transformations occurred during moments of human contact. In Iowa, Nebraska, and parts of the Great Plains where German heritage ran deep, some farmers did something that defied military logic. They invited enemy prisoners to their family tables. November 25, 1944. The Schmidt Farm, 3 miles outside Hastings, Nebraska. Feldwebel Werner Hoffman sat at a kitchen table covered with a checkered cloth, surrounded by people whose sons might be shooting at his former comrades in France. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The farmer's wife, Martha Schmidt, served him as she would serve her own family, speaking German phrases her grandmother had taught her, treating an enemy soldier with the same hospitality she would show a neighbor. "I didn't miss the wire fence," Hoffman would write years later, a line that captured the psychological complexity of captivity that felt less like imprisonment than revelation. These dinner invitations happened quietly, often without official sanction. Rural communities with German surnames, Müller, Schmidt, Weber, Fischer, saw young men who reminded them of cousins and nephews. They separated the soldier from the regime, the human from the enemy. Prisoners who had been taught that Americans were mongrel degenerates incapable of honor discovered families who showed mercy to those who had been trying to kill their sons. The soundscape of those meals, the clink of silverware on china plates, hymns hummed in German by elderly women who remembered the old country, and the careful translations that bridged enemy lines with gestures and smiles. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, invited to a Thanksgiving dinner at a farm near Fort Robinson, Nebraska, wrote in his diary, "The farmer's daughter served me pie and asked about my family in Germany. She knew her brother was fighting in the Ardennes, possibly against men like me. Yet she showed no hatred, only curiosity and something that felt like sympathy. How could a nation that treated enemies this way be weak? How could people this generous be the monsters our propaganda described?" The contradiction gnawed at prisoners' certainty. Every interaction with American civilians provided new evidence that Nazi racial theory was fiction. The farmers who supervised work details didn't match propaganda descriptions of weak, lazy Americans. They worked alongside prisoners, demonstrating techniques, sharing water during breaks, treating captured soldiers as temporary farmhands rather than subhuman enemies. Camp canteens became laboratories of American consumer culture. Prisoners lined up with camp scrip, the accumulated wages from farm labor, to purchase items that hadn't existed in German stores for years. Coca-Cola in glass bottles, thrown away half-finished. Ice cream in paper cups, a luxury reserved for the wealthy in pre-war Germany. Canned condensed milk, chocolate bars, cigarettes by the pack. The casual waste astounded men raised in scarcity. Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Zimmermann, working at a cannery near Des Moines, documented the cognitive dissonance. American workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts. They drank soda during breaks, ate sandwiches with meat thicker than our weekly ration, and threw away food without thought. The abundance wasn't propaganda or special display. This was simply normal American life, even in wartime. The evidence accumulated in letters home. German military censors reading prisoner correspondence noted a disturbing pattern. Soldiers were describing American prosperity with language that undermined Wehrmacht morale. Letters mentioned electric lights in every farmhouse, automobiles owned by ordinary workers, shops stocked with goods unavailable in Berlin. The censors could suppress some letters, but couldn't stop the psychological transformation occurring behind American wire. By winter 1944, camp newspapers, produced by prisoners and monitored by American authorities, began reflecting ideological shifts. Der Ruf, The Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, featured articles about agricultural mechanization, democratic economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. Prisoners formed discussion groups, debated Germany's future, and quietly acknowledged what many had begun to suspect. The war was already lost, not on battlefields, but in the fundamental competition between industrial systems. Medical treatment provided another vector of psychological impact. Camp hospitals treated malnourished captives with therapeutic diets, vaccinated against diseases, and provided care that exceeded what many prisoners had received as German soldiers. Malnourished Afrika Korps veterans gained weight, recovered from untreated wounds, and received dental care that would have been impossible in Germany after 1941. Dr. Wilhelm Bauer, a captured medical officer, wrote in a report discovered decades later, "They gave us penicillin, this miracle drug we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even for minor infections in prisoners." German soldiers were dying for lack of basic sulfa drugs, yet America was treating enemies with the world's most advanced medicine. This generosity from a position of strength revealed more about national character than any propaganda could convey. The winter of 1944 brought record cold to the Plains states. In barracks heated by coal stoves, prisoners layered donated clothing and wrote letters home describing the piercing winter air. But even this hardship came with American abundance. regular fuel deliveries, warm blankets, and insulated boots that German soldiers on the Eastern Front would have killed to possess. Christmas 1944 arrived with another psychological blow. Local churches, civic organizations, and school children sent packages to camps across the country. Homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, hand-drawn cards from children who couldn't understand why their parents were being kind to enemies. Carols sung in German by Methodist choirs outside camp fences. Boy Scouts delivering gifts to men who had fought against America. This was enemy kindness that made no sense within Nazi ideology. Unteroffizier Werner Krebs, watching children wave from beyond the wire at Camp Concordia, wrote a letter that censors allowed through. They know we are their enemies. Their fathers and brothers are fighting us. Yet they show us Christian charity, not as propaganda, but as genuine humanity. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. The question haunted barracks discussions through cold December nights. If America could afford to feed enemies turkey, heat their barracks, provide medical care, and show mercy to those who had tried to destroy them, what did that say about German chances? If this was how they treated prisoners, how were they supplying armies across 2 oceans? But the most devastating revelation was still to come, because holiday meals and humane treatment were just the visible surface of American industrial capacity. January 15, 1945. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner stood in a makeshift classroom watching a newsreel projector flicker to life, about to witness something that would shatter his last illusions about German victory. The film showed Higgins boat factories in New Orleans producing 700 landing craft monthly, each requiring 20,000 parts assembled by women and teenagers operating machinery with casual expertise. This wasn't propaganda. Prisoners could verify the footage through their own work assignments. The labor program had an unintended consequence. It transformed German prisoners into witnesses to American industrial supremacy. Every factory visit, every supply delivery, every careless display of abundance became another data point in a psychological equation that could reach only one conclusion. Germany had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with ideology and willpower. America had responded with mathematics. The numbers defied comprehension even when prisoners saw them firsthand. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, German work details watched production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most German facilities handled monthly. One elderly woman monitored automated controls, electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers processing hundreds of cans simultaneously, performing work that would have required 50 laborers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee, as if managing industrial miracles was unremarkable. Obergefreiter Franz Keller, who had worked at Krupp before conscription, wrote in a letter that passed camp censors, "Everything I thought I understood about industrial production was wrong. The scale here makes our factories look like medieval workshops. They waste more steel and spillage than we could produce with maximum effort." The waste haunted German prisoners more than the abundance. Perfectly good oranges discarded for minor blemishes, entire crops plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdowns among men from hunger-ravaged Germany. At a military supply depot near Fort Worth, Texas, prisoners unloaded crates stenciled with numbers that revealed production capacity beyond imagination. Boots manufactured at rates of 10,000 pairs daily, uniforms by the hundreds of thousands, rifle ammunition measured in billions of rounds. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured in Italy, witnessed something that crystallized the industrial disparity. Near Detroit, work details passed within view of the River Rouge complex, a facility employing 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Parking lots stretched for acres, filled with workers' personal automobiles. Workers in Germany rarely owned bicycles, Goetz wrote in his diary. Here, factory laborers drove to work in their own cars. Many owned two, one for work, one for family use. The guard told us this casually, as if such prosperity was normal. It was. The truth American captivity revealed. But material abundance alone couldn't explain the transformation occurring in German prisoners. Something deeper was shifting. A recognition that the society producing this wealth operated on fundamentally different principles than Nazi Germany. Camp libraries stocked thousands of books in German. Universities offered correspondence courses. Discussion groups debated political philosophy without fear of denunciation. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in educational programs by early 1945, hungry for knowledge about the democratic systems that had defeated them. The camp newspapers evolved into laboratories of ideological transformation. Der Ruf, carefully monitored but not censored into meaninglessness, published articles examining economic systems, constitutional government, and post-war reconstruction. Editorial meetings featured prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis, now debating the merits of free markets versus command economies, individual rights versus state control. Major Paul Neuland, monitoring the re-education program, reported in February 1945. The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They've seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America. The questions multiplied with each passing month. How could a mongrel democracy outproduce the master race? How could a nation that treated workers well outperform slave labor? How could showing mercy to enemies demonstrate strength rather than weakness? Every Nazi assumption met contradictory evidence behind American wire. Theater performances and camp soccer leagues provided psychological release, but also reinforced the strangeness of American captivity. In what kind of prison did enemies organize cultural events, publish newspapers, and attend university lectures? In Germany, such privileges existed only for the elite. Here, ordinary prisoners, farm boys, and factory workers accessed intellectual resources that would have been impossible even for educated Germans before the war. Medical care continued demolishing Nazi racial theories. When Unteroffizier Hans Müller's wife wrote that their son was dying of scarlet fever in Hamburg, unable to access medicine, American church groups sent care packages to Germany, to enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated German people from the Nazi regime in ways that seemed incomprehensible to prisoners raised on propaganda about American hatred and Jewish vengeance. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the captured surgeon, documented cases that revealed American medical philosophy. They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed confidence we never understood: the security of absolute power. Spring 1945 brought the war's endgame into sharp focus. News of German cities falling reached camps through American newspapers. Prisoners could read freely. The industrial capacity they had witnessed explained the inevitable outcome. You couldn't defeat a nation that produced Liberty ships in 4 days, B-24 bombers every 63 minutes, and landing craft by the thousands, while simultaneously feeding enemy prisoners turkey dinners and providing them university education. The logistics of defeat became clear through accumulated observations. Prisoners had watched supply chains function with precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht achieved at its peak. They had seen rural electrification bringing power to 90% of Texas farms, while German villages remained dark. They had witnessed agricultural mechanization producing yields double Germany's best land. They had experienced medical care with penicillin, miracle drugs German soldiers died without, used freely on enemy prisoners. March 20th, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. Feldwebel Otto Krebs received a letter from his mother describing conditions in Germany. Food queues stretching for blocks, shops with empty shelves, electricity for 2 hours daily. He sat in an electrically lit barracks, warm from a coal stove that received regular fuel, having just eaten a dinner that included meat, vegetables, and fresh bread. The contrast required no commentary. "We are eating better as prisoners than our families eat as free people," Krebs wrote to his brother serving on the Eastern Front, a letter German military censors intercepted and filed as evidence of declining Wehrmacht morale. But the most devastating psychological blow came from captured Italian prisoners' treatment after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian POWs who cooperated were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in restaurants, some dating American women. The Italians had betrayed the Axis, yet received treatment better than Germany had given them as allies. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann watched Italian POWs board trucks for unsupervised work details and wrote, "The Americans show them no hatred despite betrayal. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system. They reward cooperation, punish only continued resistance. It is practical rather than vindictive, the logic of confidence rather than fear." By April 1945, over 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in democracy courses. They studied American history, constitutional law, and economic theory. Stanford professors traveled to camps delivering lectures on governance and civil rights. The University of Chicago provided correspondence materials. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians discovered a society that welcomed all social classes to universities, that conducted scientific research leading the world, that criticized itself openly without state punishment. The transformation seemed impossible until you understood its mechanism. America had converted enemies not through coercion, but through observation. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism more powerful than any propaganda campaign. Prosperity had defeated ideology. What none of them knew yet was that the final revelation would come not from abundance, but from horror. April 19th, 1945. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The newsreel projector illuminated faces frozen in disbelief as grainy footage revealed what American soldiers had discovered behind German lines. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves, crematorium ovens still warm with ash. Unteroffizier Werner Krebs watched the screen and felt something inside him collapse that had nothing to do with military defeat. The psychological transformation of German prisoners was about to become a moral reckoning. For months, prisoners had wrestled with evidence of American superiority in production, organization, and prosperity. They had adjusted their understanding of industrial capacity, revised their assessments of democratic efficiency, and quietly acknowledged that Germany had lost the war. But nothing had prepared them for this. Proof that everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. American authorities showed liberation footage from Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen to prisoner audiences across dozens of camps. Some refused to believe initially, claiming the images were propaganda fabrications, desperate attempts to maintain some fragment of national pride. But the evidence overwhelmed denial. Testimony from American soldiers who had entered the camps, photographs documenting systematic murder, news reports from multiple sources, and eventually, letters from Germany confirming the horror their own families had helped create through silence or complicity. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who had maintained quiet dignity through 19 months of captivity, wrote in his diary, "I watched men weep who had not cried when captured, when wounded, when receiving news of family deaths in bombing raids. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." The projection room at Camp Concordia fell silent after the footage ended. No one spoke. The clatter of folding chairs being put away, the soft sound of grown men trying not to sob, the creak of barracks doors opening to let prisoners stumble into Kansas sunshine that felt obscene after witnessing such darkness. This was the moment American re-education succeeded completely, not through lectures about democracy, but through undeniable documentation of what Nazi ideology had produced. Every meal they had eaten as prisoners now carried different meaning. American abundance hadn't been proof of weakness or decadence. It had been the product of a system that valued human life rather than destroyed it. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of France and North Africa, wrote a letter to his mother that German censors intercepted and filed. "They fed us turkey while we starved prisoners. They gave us medicine while we experimented on captives. They showed us mercy while we built factories of death. I am ashamed to wear this uniform. I am ashamed to call myself German." The spring and summer of 1945 brought news of Germany's complete collapse. Cities in ruins. The Reich divided among occupying powers. Hitler dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker. Millions displaced, starving, living in rubble. The prisoners in American camps faced an impossible reality. They were eating better, living better, and being treated better than the German people they had fought to protect. Camp discussions that had focused on agricultural techniques and industrial methods now turned to moral reconstruction. How could Germany rebuild not just buildings, but humanity? How could a nation that had perpetrated such evil rejoin civilization? The prisoners who had witnessed American prosperity now understood they were being prepared for something more important than repatriation. They were being trained to rebuild German democracy. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They boarded ships carrying them back across the Atlantic to a homeland that no longer existed as they had known it. The journey reversed their arrival, leaving American abundance for German devastation, leaving electric lights and full meals for darkness and hunger, leaving mercy for judgment. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann recorded his departure from Camp Herne in June 1946. The camp commander shook my hand at the gate. He wished me luck rebuilding Germany. I realized then that America had been preparing us for this moment all along. They fed us not to be kind, but to show us what prosperity looked like. They treated us well not from weakness, but from confidence. They educated us not for punishment, but for partnership. The ships that carried them home passed Liberty ships still delivering supplies to Europe. The same vessels that had brought them to America as prisoners now passed them as returning citizens of a defeated nation. But these men carried cargo more valuable than any material shipment: knowledge of how democratic societies functioned, evidence that prosperity came from freedom rather than conquest, and understanding that treating people with dignity produced strength rather than weakness. The contrast between American camps and post-war Germany completed the psychological transformation. Prisoners who had eaten turkey and pie returned to families subsisting on bread rations and ersatz coffee. Men who had worked on mechanized American farms found German agriculture dependent on horse-drawn equipment and manual labor. Soldiers who had experienced heated barracks with electric lights came home to cities without electricity, without fuel, without hope. But they also brought something Germany desperately needed: a vision of what was possible. Many former POWs rose to prominence in West Germany's reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to agriculture, and American democratic ideals to politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained behind American wire. The transformation's success exceeded all projections. Of the 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Post-war surveys showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades, relationships that began across barbed wire and evolved into lifelong friendships. August 15, 1985. Austin, Texas. Over 500 former German POWs returned to America for a 40th anniversary reunion, bringing families to show them where transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had worked at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later became a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke to assembled crowds. Life in the camps was improvement for many of us. We discovered running water, heat, abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeld-Weibel Kurt Meir, who had worked Iowa farms, added his testimony. The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared meals, knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us, this changed us forever. The reunion dinner featured turkey, deliberate symbolism that brought tears to elderly men remembering their first Thanksgiving behind American wire. Former Oberst Hermann Goetz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured everything. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in lies. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen truth. America showed us that strength comes from production, not conquest, from diversity, not hatred, from freedom, not tyranny. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of transformation that had seemed impossible when those first prisoners arrived expecting starvation and found turkey instead. The story of German POWs in American camps remains one of history's most successful re-education programs, accomplished not through coercion, but through observation. America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through undeniable reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against totalitarianism more powerful than any lecture. The prisoners were converted by prosperity, transformed by mercy, and educated by example. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and democratic reconstruction of Germany were built on foundations laid in camps where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity came from freedom, that strength came from treating people with dignity, and that the future belonged to those who created rather than destroyed. In the end, America's secret weapon wasn't bombs or tanks. It was the simple, overwhelming evidence of what democracy could build. German POWs were stunned by turkey and pie, but they were changed by the system that produced such abundance while treating enemies with humanity. That transformation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, helped build the post-war order that prevented another global conflict. They came expecting starvation. They found Thanksgiving. And in that discovery, they found the future.